calls them uninterrupted premises. I would call them historical facts. The mutawatirat are when so many people have testified to something, it becomes impossible to deny it if you're sane. And this is important because this is one of the foundations of human knowledge, the mutawatirat. I wrote an article about how Holocaust denial undermined Islam. And my premise in that article, and I actually spoke with Khalid Blankenship, who I really trust, and Khalid knows more about history than anybody I've ever met. He's a professor at Philadelphia, in Philadelphia at Temple University, but really brilliant man and phenomenal knowledge of human history with a specialization on, he did his PhD on the collapse of the Umayyad, which he argues that it imploded from within. There wasn't any, just expanded too rapidly, too quickly, and couldn't sustain it. But, you know, I asked him, it was at a time when I think, you know, one of the Muslim leaders had called the Holocaust into question. There's a lot of people that question the Holocaust. But, you know, I called him up and I said, listen, do you think it's acceptable to argue that the Holocaust is mutawatir? In other words, there's so many people that witnessed it that the idea that they all collaborated to concoct this story, this false story, is impossible to believe. And he said, absolutely. I would consider it mutawatir as a historian. You know, the numbers are debatable, and that's where a lot of the problem arises. You know, they settled on 6 million, but the numbers were debatable. But he actually thought that 6 million was not far-fetched. He said it's between 4 and 8. But it was just hard to tell because they didn't have the type of census that they would have needed to have in any case. That's a mutawatir is when so many people have argued this thing or have said that it happened. So we know that in 1066, right, what happened? I mean, lots of things happened. But what big thing happened for Western people? Yeah, right? William the Conqueror. Normans invaded England. So that's something that if you deny it, you're denying reality, really. Because there's just too many. I mean, the example they use in books of epistemology is, and no offense to the Australians, is that Australia, that it's impossible to believe that there was a conspiracy by cartographers and others, that Australia really doesn't exist and that it was completely made up. Nobody would believe that in their right mind. But you would be amazed. There's a Hindu PhD, he has a legitimate PhD, who wrote a book arguing that it was the Hindus that built the Taj Mahal and not the Muslims. And you can go online and see there's a whole website dedicated to this argument that the Taj Mahal is actually a Hindu temple and not a Muslim temple. So we have people out there that will deny reality. And this is one of the big problems in communication and in trying to convince people of things, is that you're dealing with a lot of nutcases. And nutcases can have PhDs. In fact, there's a considerable number, I think, do. So that makes it more problematic because they've been legitimized by institutions that say that this person is, you know, a scholar in whatever field he's been given that PhD in, and that he's also a first-class researcher, because that's essentially the PhD is teaching people how to become first-class researchers. So anyway, we know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ claimed prophecy, and we know he performed miracles, because those are mutawatir reports. And so this argument that, you know what I find really interesting about about Orientalists. If you read like the Encyclopedia of Islam, whenever there's a really nice hadith, they'll say, this is clearly fabricated, or this is obviously hagiographical, or they'll make these arguments. And then if there's any hadith that will put any bad light on the Muslims or on the Prophet ﷺ, they'll just state it as historical fact. Like the age of Aisha, it's just historical fact. They don't accept the hadiths of the palm tree that moaned, obviously made up. They don't accept the hadiths, all these amazing hadiths, the splitting of the moon, obviously made up, even though the Qur'an clearly states it. None of the Quraysh denied it. There's no denial of it. It was mutawatir. It was experienced mutawatir. In fact, they said sihrun muntashir because they went out and asked the people around Mecca if they saw it too. Now, whatever that was, if it was split moon phenomenon, like Imaduddin, the astronomer, suggests, there is a astronomical event called split moon phenomenon, and that it could have been that. Or it could have been the physical splitting, which is what obviously most scholars argue. But that something happened in Mecca on that day when the Prophet pointed to the moon and the moon appeared to split in two to the people of Mecca. That's mutawatir. Li'ilafi Quraysh. That's mutawatir. There were many people alive when that surah was revealed. The people of Mecca saw birds come and pelt the army of Abraha and killed many of the soldiers and the elephants, and they fled back to Ethiopia. They saw that. And after that, the Arabs called the Quraysh Ahlullah, the people of God. They didn't mess with them. They were afraid of them, seriously. That's mutawatir. It's as sound and true as 1066. Because if you're going to accept the same criteria for 1066, then you have to accept the criteria for these things as well. There are miracles of the Prophet that are not mutawatir. Many of them are not mutawatir, but there are certain ones that are mutawatir. They're historical fact. The moaning of the palm tree is a historical fact. The splitting of the moon is a historical fact. It's not fantasy. So, the Arabs say, "Ba'ukum tajurru wa ba'una la tajur." The rules of grammar work for your words, but you're not letting them work for our words. It's like you have a different set of criteria when you deal with Muslims than when you deal with your own tradition.